You may not be a hockey fan, but I'm a Chicago Blackhawks fan, believe it or not, all my life.
Ah.
So I got my jersey on in honor of you.
Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show. It's the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible, and then helps you to better explain your faith with both courage and compassion. If we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm the host of this podcast, your Apologetics Guy, and I'm also a professor of Bible and theology here at the Moody Bible Institute in downtown Chicago. I want to welcome you to my independent show. Well, are there any historical facts that support the bodily resurrection of Jesus? In this episode, we're talking about the very best evidences for the resurrection of Jesus and how you can respond with some powerful talking points to some of these tough challenges that we get about the resurrection of Jesus from our skeptical friends, skeptical family members. And my guest on the show today is a very special guest coming to us via StreamYard. His name is Dr. Gary Habermas, and Gary is Distinguished Research Professor of Apologetics and Philosophy at Liberty University. Welcome to the show, Gary.
Thank you, Mikel. Glad to be here and glad to be with you all the other times we've been on together.
Yeah, you've been with me on the Table podcast before. That's the show that I used to host back in Dallas. I used to host that show for 6 years at Dallas Theological Seminary. But today, I'm really pleased to have you on my show, on the Apologetics Guy Show, because you just wrote this massive tome called On the Resurrection Evidences. And this is volume 1 of 4 massive tomes that are in process right now. And when it's all done, I really think this is going to be the very best education that somebody can get in terms of one complete book series on the resurrection of Jesus. And it's been estimated that you have spent about 32,000 plus hours working just on writing this book, wholly apart from your other academic research that you've done beforehand. And this is part of your magnum opus. Gary, I remember 5 years ago, I was interviewing you on the Table podcast with Daryl Bach, and you had mentioned on the show that you were about 4,500 pages in, and that Daryl was really the one who had encouraged you or actually challenged you to get started on this. Is that right?
He did. We were on the John Ankerberg show, one of the many times both of us have been on there, and we were in John's office, and well, John was kind of pushing me to start this book. And I said, John, I don't really know what I want to do because this thing's going to take me for the rest of my life. And I don't know if I have a whole nother life to do it. And so Daryl was there and he said, well, I could tell you for a fact it's going to take you longer than you think or something like that. And he used his book of Luke, his 2-volume commentary as an example. And he said, nah, you know, Daryl and the way he teases, and Daryl goes, nah, you're never going to start this. And I thought about that. Mike Lacona and some others had been pushing me too. And I thought, I've written, at that point, half of my books were on the resurrection. And and I thought, what else do I need to say? And but Mike said something to me. Daryl said, you'll probably never do it. And that pushed me. And Mike said, we don't want this stuff to die in your brain. And I thought, well, golly, that's convicting. And so I started. And I'm almost done with the entire manuscript. And it is about 6,000 manuscript pages long. Volume 1 was just short of 1,100 pages. I think Volume 2, I got some numbers recently. I don't keep track of it, but I think Volume 2 is 1,000, and I think Volume 3 is 900. And I still have Volume 4 to go. But the 6,000 is manuscript pages, so I think it'll come out something like a little under 4,000 published pages on the resurrection.
Wow. Well, what a massive treasure this whole series is going to be, and what a gem we already have in this book right here, just volume 1. Let's briefly mention how to play the game, so to speak. How can we talk about the resurrection of Jesus in highly skeptical environments? When we're talking with people who don't see the Bible as any kind of spiritual authority, help us get oriented just to how to enter the world of historians as we talk about Jesus in these highly skeptical environments.
Sure. Well, when I was going to school and doing my graduate degrees, it was a lot easier for me to think like a critic than it was to think like an evangelical. I grew up in a German Baptist church, a conservative church, and I could think very well like that. But I just read books and books and books and books on the other side. In fact, I can tell you when I first started college, I was 17 years old, and I went to the college bookstore, a secular school, and they had the famous New Testament scholar Rudolf Bultmann in the bookstore. So I suppose some professor was requiring Bultmann, and I had already read a lot about Bultmann, and there were 2 books on the shelf by Bultmann, and I bought them and took them home. And I was only 17. I mean, what I mean, it was like walking on eggshells. I thought to myself, at that time, this guy was the preeminent New Testament scholar in the world, probably second only to Karl Barth in total theology. And I would say, the way I count leftness, I would say he was very much to the left of Bart Ehrman. And that's because Bart uses history and omits a lot of things from the Gospels historically, and Bultmann didn't. I started asking myself questions. How would I refute this objection, or how would I refute this objection? And Bultmann said the resurrection was mythology. Well, I found out a lot of critics were admitting this data, and I made a list. How can I refute a mythical theory with these facts? And that started the minimal facts argument. I made a list one night in grad school. It was a few years later, sitting in a chair. I remember the chair I was in. And I wrote down, these are the known facts about the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. And these facts, and I would put asterisks by them, show that it's not a myth. And that was the beginning of using scholarship that critics allow, only scholarship that critics allow, to show that there's enough of a basis to refute the critical theories and to defend the resurrection. Sorry for that long explanation.
So we are talking about critical scholars who are looking for corroboration. Mostly corroboration is the name of the game in historical Jesus studies. And so you are meeting them right where they're at by finding common ground. And you're talking about the Bible mostly in a way that they are used to thinking about the Bible and using the Bible in historical research, ways they're used to considering. And I love your minimal facts approach. Well, it's pretty amazing, but it's often misunderstood. And so it's misunderstood by skeptics and even by some Christians. And so help us to understand this. Gary, how do you define a minimal fact?
Yeah, I use 2 criteria, and I want to be clear about this because a fellow just wrote a critique, an unbeliever just wrote a critique of my argument for the resurrection. And he said that my argument is fallacious because it is totally based on something as a fact because critics say so. Right? That is totally false. It is not my argument at all. I have 2 steps for when a fact is historical, when it makes the grade. And the first one is when every fact you use, every morsel, is backed up by multiple evidences. Now, that's not to be confused with the criterion multiple attestation. Multiple attestation can be multiple facts, but there's a lot of data. Say for the empty tomb, I produced over 20 arguments for the empty tomb using an uninspired, critical New Testament that non-Christian New Testament scholars would use. Over 20. Now, a lot of those are the text, but a lot of them are not the text. So the first point is I'm not going to use any facts which don't have multiple facts in their favor. Now, the second distant criterion is because the facts are so good, critics allow these to be used. Almost all critics allow these to be used. But that's not the reason. Of course, it's fallacious if I use facts only because people who don't like my arguments use these facts. Well, they could be wrong, or they could give them up tomorrow. The fact that they will grant these different evidences simply means that we can get the argument started more quickly and can get into it without them objecting to every point. But by far, as I say always, by far the main reason for accepting these facts is that there's multiple reasons for each one. In fact, I'll tell you, McCullen, the big book that you just mentioned, just under 1,000 pages, I have 6 facts. And of course, they're not just 6 loner facts. They're the data that back up the 6 facts. And each of those 6 facts averages almost 15 independent reasons for holding those facts. 15 arguments a piece, and I repeat, 15 arguments a piece, the way critics count facts. Someone who rejects inspiration, let's just say they reject the authorship of the 4 Gospels, the traditional authorship, at least Matthew and John, and all they give you is Paul's 7 of his 13 epistles, and they will grant these facts. So I use those facts to go after their counter theories.
So let's briefly mention those facts. I'm glad we're clarifying that here, because it's really the number one way I think that people tend to misread your work. You're not just making an appeal to authority, okay, right? You're not just appealing to scholars. You're not just saying these are facts because these critical scholars say so.
That's a joke. It's just not true, but we hear it a lot.
Yeah. So you're not saying that these things are facts just because some critical scholars say so. You're saying that the evidence is so strong historically that even those critics, people who don't accept the resurrection, even they have to admit, they have no choice but to admit that these things, if they're being honest, that these things are actually historical facts. And in your book, you lay out the top 6: the death of Jesus, the disciples' belief that they really saw the risen Jesus, the early preaching of the gospel, the transformation of the disciples, and then, of course, the conversion of the church persecutor Paul and the skeptic James. Now, you've often recommended starting with Paul, and I found it's really helpful advice actually in my spiritual conversations with skeptics. I love using the minimal facts approach and starting with Paul. But tell us why you like to start with Paul.
Because the hardcore critics, here's the good part. They'll give you Paul. Here's the bad part. He's often the only one they will give you. So, and then when I say Paul, there's 13 books in the New Testament that bear Paul's name. They will let you use 7 of them. And Bartimer, for example, others, almost every New Testament author who writes an introduction where they're trying to tell you what's going on in New Testament studies, they'll tell you that 7 of Paul's books are fair game. And what's interesting is that if a conservative pastor who believed the Bible was the Word of God was going to preach a series of messages for the church on what do we know about Paul and his epistles, these are the same 7 epistles he would want. And the 7 they grant, and you say, well, 7 out of 13, what if they take some different ones than 7? No, it's always these 7. And the 7 are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, then you have to skip over to Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and the little non-theological book, Philemon, 1 chapter. So the big 6 then would be the first 4, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, and then Philippians, and what most New Testament scholars think is the earliest New Testament book, 1st Thessalonians. Those 6, they basically won't argue with you if you use those 6. Now, when I say won't argue, that doesn't mean everything in it is true. They just mean Paul was a scholar. I like to say Paul had a PhD in Old Testament. He was a Pharisee. He was a scholar. He wouldn't lie. He might be wrong, according to these critics. He might be wrong, but he wouldn't intentionally lie or mislead you. He believes in objective ethics, so he's a good person to cite because he's a good guy, and he at least thinks he's giving you the data. So they'll say, use those first 6 books, Philemon, if it helps you, but use those first 6 books. And I do. I usually make the main point on the resurrection from both 1 Corinthians 15, first 11 verses, and the end of Galatians 1, the beginning of Galatians 2, which there's no chapter division there in the original. So that's 2 texts from 1 Corinthians 15, Galatians 1, the beginning of Galatians 2. Those texts alone, and the critics grant that data for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the strongest argument for the bodily resurrection of Jesus. How do you explain that?
Well, recently, I've been doing this in a few podcasts where I've been saying, what's the strongest evidence for the resurrection? And people are really interested, and they expect me to say, well, I don't know what they expect me to say. I mean, if you read critical scholars, they will tell you, some major critical scholars will tell you, that the strongest evidence for an appearance of the risen Jesus is the appearance of the 12. And here is where there's multiple reasons, but there's multiple attestation, multiple textual attestation for group appearances. I mean, you've got cases of them, and if they're the same appearance, you've got Matthew 28, Luke 24, John 20. You've got the creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. You've got the what's called, it's another creed, but it's an apostolic preaching point in Acts chapter 10 and also Acts chapter 2. You have a number of references that are very, very early, but refer to the appearance of the 12. I would probably put that maybe third or fourth. I would say the strongest two evidences for the resurrection, and this would be pretty close. I go in and out. They're kind of a tie. I think the two strongest evidences, number one, are the early creeds. The early creeds, which even critics, Gert Ludemann just died a couple years ago, German atheist, New Testament scholar, member of the Jesus Seminar. He said the preaching of the disciples on the resurrection started immediately. It started immediately after the events in question, whatever those events were. And Bart Ehrman says that there are early creeds from 1 to 2 years after the cross, and certainly within the first years, like 30 to 35 is pretty much a given for some of these early creeds. I think that is outstanding because it's very, very early, and it's reported by the people who were there. And now you can't prove that the apostles came up with all of these creeds, but the second one, or the one I interchanged with the first one, is that Paul went to Jerusalem either 5 or 6 years after the cross. Now, you do that math real easily. If Paul was converted at +2 or +3 after the cross, which is almost always the date, that's 32 to 33. He says 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem. 3 + 3 is 36. If he was converted at +2, it's 35. So at 35 or 36, he goes to Jerusalem. He spends 15 days with Peter and James in Galatians 1:18. The Greek word hysteresis, the root word is Histor, from which we get our word history. That doesn't mean that because he uses Histor, he's got to say, I'm an historian. He's just saying he's doing research, he's investigating, he's interviewing, he's asking questions of Peter and James. And I think that's a knockout, because if he knows the creeds already, and critics think he does, I'll just say parenthetically, the Jesus Seminar that reject about 90% of the red letter words of Jesus, they think that Paul knew the 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following creed, or at least the data in it. Paul knew it before he set out for Damascus, before he was converted. So if he had that early material, and then in Galatians 1 and 2, it says he specifically asked First Peter and James, and then later he went back again, and John was there. You got the big four, Paul, Peter, James the brother of Jesus, and John. He's interviewing the eyewitnesses. So when you got the early creeds from immediately afterwards, and remember the book of Galatians is about the gospel. That's a theme. What's the gospel? He said in Galatians 2:2, I was given in the gospel I was preaching, and they agreed with him. Okay, that combination of early creeds affirmed by the eyewitnesses, the data affirmed by the eyewitnesses, I think that's the best 1-2 punch. I'll put multiple criteria or the appearance of the 12 right at 3 and 4, right after those first two.
Wow. So, one thing most people I talk to don't realize is that critical scholars who study the historical Jesus actually read the Bible. They don't read it as a spiritual authority, of course, but at least they read it as ancient documents. And when Christians talk to people on the street or in coffee shops or at work, they find that most people don't really know very much about the Bible, and they don't know how history actually works, how historians study figures in ancient history. So how can we respond if someone says, well, you're just quoting the Bible, and I don't believe the Bible? So are we stuck when they say that? How would you respond?
Well, yeah. And you know what? They say that all the time. Mostly the crowd that calls themselves scholars
Mm-hmm.
that do not believe that Jesus ever lived and that Bart Ehrman makes fun of for 20 pages in his book, Did Jesus Exist? And Ehrman says of the thousands of individuals who make up the society, well, the two major societies, the critical societies, he said there are thousands of professors who teach in this way, and he said, I don't know one of them who thinks Jesus never lived. So right away, and he goes off on all their sources, and he says, these people are upset that we don't use their books, and their books are self-published, and they call themselves scholars, and he uses some really strong language, but he goes off on them. But that's what you hear a lot. They're the ones that speak the loudest and the most shrill voices, it seems like, and they just go, as one guy just said to me recently about this big book, he said, it's a bunch of garbage. It's a cult. You're only quoting the Bible. Okay, great. Well, that shows you don't know how to do research. I don't say that to him, but the problem is, if you ask Bart Ehrman or Gerrit Ludemann when he was alive, or any of these skeptics, Jewish scholars who are New Testament specialists but are not Christians, you ask them what sources they use. Gezer Vermesh passed away a few years ago, and Pinchas Lapid did a few years ago, two Jewish New Testament scholars. They both grant all this. And here's Bart Ehrman's comment. It's brilliant. He says, I'm asked, do I accept Paul because I accept the Bible? And therefore, I'm prejudiced because I think the Bible is the Word of God. He said, let me ask you a question. He said, if I'm going to do a book on the Revolutionary War in America, and I want to get eyewitness sources, and George Washington is still alive, do I cite George Washington because he's prejudiced and he won the war and he was the first president? Or do I cite George Washington because he was there, he's the biggest name, he was a leading general, and he knew what was going on? He said, I quote Washington because he's a first-rate scholar, not because he's an American and I'm an American. That's not why I quote the Apostle Paul. That's kind of how the critics do it. They're using the best sources, and you can use almost any critical source. Jesus Seminar guys, they're going to say, Paul is your best source for Jesus, period. There's virtually no debate on it.
Yeah. Well, it's hard for us to put ourselves sometimes in the shoes of a skeptic, but it's also tough for people who aren't Christian in this conversation because many of them, I think, don't know that the Gospels, and especially the writings of Paul, are taken seriously. And this is really the best documentary evidence for the life of Jesus, and so that's why it's taken seriously even by atheist scholars, other critical scholars who don't accept the resurrection, but do want to know what Jesus actually said and did. And so this is why we do the work that we do as historians. And now I remember you mentioned the mythicists, or I call them the Jesus mythers. I do remember how Ehrman told the Huffington Post once that you might not like established religion, but he says, surely the best way to promote such an agenda is not to deny what, he says, virtually every sane historian on the planet has come to conclude, whether we like it or not, Jesus certainly existed. And that's coming from an atheist. But really, to deny that Jesus is a real figure of ancient history is conspiracy level stuff. So it's kind of like saying 9/11 didn't happen, or that we never put a man on the moon, right? But now I've talked to people who acknowledge the facts of this case, like the crucifixion, the disciples' belief that they truly saw the risen Jesus, and even the conversions of Paul and James. So some people will acknowledge these facts, but then they want to push back on the resurrection itself and say something like, I don't know what they saw, but it certainly wasn't bodily resurrection. Or so maybe they'll say it was hallucinations, or maybe they'll say they had visionary experiences and then they began to proclaim Jesus as risen from the dead That's why they say Jesus rose from the dead, either because of hallucinations or because of visionary experiences. How do you engage with those kinds of objections?
Well, it depends on what the mood is, how the previous conversation has gone, what looks like the best place to jump in. I could say a bunch of different things. One thing I'd say is, you said vision or hallucination. If it's, let me just take one of those two, vision. What kind of vision would it be? If they said, oh, I don't know, like when somebody sees a ghost, an angel or something, I'll say, well, let's talk about it. Was Jesus really there when he appeared? If they go, maybe, then I take that as a starting part and I go on. Well, do you know that the appearance to the 12 is the best attested? You know that Paul knew all this. Paul met Jesus, other people were in the group with him, but he went to Jerusalem and checked it out with the biggest named eyewitnesses in the world, namely Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. They agreed with his message in Galatians chapter 2. So if it's that, now you have to account for a really existing something. What if 5 people saw an angel in the living room and you think they're all nuts? Were you drinking? Were you on drugs? What's going on? But you could theoretically get some data from people who saw this thing at one time. If they go, no, it's an hallucination, then I bring out the passages. A lot of Christians don't know this, but many of the appearances, of all the appearances, there are more appearances to groups as defined as 2 or more, like the way 2 guys on the way to Emmaus in Luke 24. There are more appearances to groups than there are to individuals. And in the creed, that early creed, 1 Corinthians 15:3, you'll almost find no scholar that will almost nobody will take that, won't take that as a very early report by the best eyewitness around, Paul. Of the 6 appearances there, 3 of them are to groups. Now, Paul adds his own name at the end in verse 8, but 3 of the appearances are to groups. And so right away, you start with one of these early appearances, that list of appearances that the Jesus Seminar says Paul knew about on his way to Damascus. And by the way, Mikkel, we often talk about, well, the story keeps getting bigger and bigger as it moves on. The book is later, so there's more story to it, more mythology. 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following is the longest list of appearances in one context in the New Testament. It's also the earliest list of appearances. So that turns the criticism on its head.
That's right. Yeah. And so if Paul is actually quoting this creed, we know it had to be around before he wrote 1 Corinthians, and he had to know about the resurrection. He had to know about the resurrection reports before he followed Jesus, because what was he persecuting, right? He was persecuting the resurrection preaching that the apostles were saying people, they were telling people that Jesus appeared to them. And so he was persecuting that resurrection preaching. And he also had to understand that, I think, to see Jesus and know that he was seeing the risen Jesus on the Damascus road. And so I think he had to know it just to understand what he was seeing then when Jesus appeared to him.
Yep.
So I think this puts the formulation of this creed basically at the foot of the cross.
It does. It does. Yep.
Yeah, an interesting sociological question is, why would so many Jews begin to worship Jesus on a Sunday? Again, I think this points to the resurrection appearances. Does that play into your argument at all?
If I were going to give a list of data for the resurrection, I give a list of 12, and then I cut the 12 down to 6. And those 6 are my minimal facts. Now, just outside the 6, we have the empty tomb, which is in a recent survey I did for this big volume, these 4 volumes of books. In a survey I did of, it's not the end of the world. I mean, it's not every scholar there is, but it was of over 250 critical scholars with terminal degrees related to this subject. And the number who admit the empty tomb now is up to 80%. But I still don't say that I still don't use it as a minimal fact. So the empty tomb helps a lot. The appearances, we have many from different angles. And if the person, Mikkel, here's the objection I get most of all. It used to be hallucinations. Here's the objection I get most of all. They'll go, What is it about this world that should make me even open? I've never seen a resurrection appearance. I've never seen an angel. I've never seen a ghost. Most people, I think, haven't, they might say. So why should I be open to it? And I'll stop the conversation there and I'll go time out. Let's talk about near-death experiences. And they know I've done a lot of publishing on this. There's over 300 evidential ones where the data are just unbelievable. It is very hard to explain away the data. And if there is an afterlife, I'll say this parenthetically, in a recent survey of atheists and agnostics alone, 32% of them affirmed heaven or some kind of afterlife. 32% of atheists and agnostics. Okay, if there's an afterlife, you have to drop your objection that nobody knows anything about this, or there's nothing like that in the world, or we don't have any data. If there is an afterlife, if you want to be a good researcher, you need to be open to the data I'm presenting for an afterlife, because I have other data, scientific data, over 48 cases where people have no brain waves and no heartbeat at the same time, recent complaints notwithstanding, but over 48, and they produce data that goes on while they were out, heart and brain alike. All right, if there's an afterlife, don't tell me somebody can't come back, that there can't come, somebody else can come back from another world, another existence. I don't mean multiple universes. I mean from another dimension. So if they want to talk science, and that's what they do, you know, the saying today, it's all about the science. Okay, right. If it's all about the science, there's an afterlife. If there's an afterlife, what don't you get about the evidences for the resurrection? Well, I'm not there. See, that's your problem. You're not there. It's because you don't like the idea, not because you don't like the data.
Yeah, that's really a great point. You know, a lot of times I find that the people I talk to are pushing back on the historical facts, not just as historical facts, but they're pushing back on the theological implications of these historical facts. Because there's a personal challenge that comes. There's a claim on your life if Jesus is who he claimed to be, if you're going to take seriously the resurrection reports and how that vindicates Jesus' claims about himself to be divine. And now you got to ask yourself, what are you going to do with Jesus?
It is. And a guy I know of who is not a Christian, he's very nice. He's not a Christian. He's open, but he doesn't like, he'll just tell you, he doesn't like what changes would have to be made in his life. He'd rather go on and just say, I don't know, and leave it right there, because he doesn't like that last point you made about lifestyle.
Yeah. Now, Gary, you might not know this, but I was actually introduced to your work through your near-death studies, your book, Beyond Death with J.P. Moreland. You presented this at Biola University when I was there doing my Apologetics MA work in my master's program there. And later I heard you talk about the minimal facts approach to the resurrection, and that's kind of what got me interested in historical Jesus studies. And eventually I met my mentor, Dr. Darrell Bach, and did my doctoral dissertation on the historical Jesus. So I love how you blend those two things together, your near-death studies and your resurrection research.
You picked a good school. And I go both ways. If resurrection, then afterlife. If afterlife, you should be more open to resurrection. So I think because afterlife, I mean, this is just a simple thing. And don't mean to be talking about near-death experiences here, but there are millions now of cases, thought to be over up to 20 million people in the world who have had near-death experiences. But here's the simple point. Let's not even talk about any evidence. The person says, I was up above my body. I watched the doctors beating on my chest, and I started shouting, quit beating on me. I'm fine. I love it up here. I didn't even want to come back. I had a mother who just delivered her third child, hadn't seen the baby yet, said I didn't want to come back. I said, really? She said, I didn't want to come back. And okay, here's the point. They're screaming at the doctor. The doctor doesn't say, quit screaming, I'm trying to do surgery. The person is somewhere where they can interact with this world, but nobody can hear them. There's another, I don't know what you want to call it, dimension. There's another area there where they say, if you just let me go, I could go on. I could move on. And from what I can see, I want to go there. That tells me something very, very important. If there's a world like that, don't tell me I have no right or grounds for talking about the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, it should at least make someone curious to be open to considering if human consciousness can actually survive the death of our physical bodies, at least the first few moments after the death of the physical body. If human consciousness can survive that, then I think you have to be open to the idea of an afterlife. You have to be open to the idea of God. And I think the resurrection of Jesus should be very interesting to you. Because naturalism, I don't think, can really make sense of this kind of phenomenon. Naturalism can't make the best sense of the full human experience, especially in this area as we think about what happens beyond the death of the physical body.
You know, McCall, ask this question. This is starting to make grounds in philosophy. If you're a naturalist or a materialist, and you think the material world, the natural world is all there is, and there's no afterlife, there's no God, there's no whatever, what evidence establishes your world view? And naturalists are starting to acknowledge you can't prove naturalism. You can't prove materialism. You can't do any scientific test that proves this world or your laboratory is the only thing that exists in the world, or when you go home at night, that's all that exists in the world. You can't prove that. So they keep saying, oh, you guys believe fairy tales. You guys are citing an old book. What is there for naturalism or materialism? That's a question to ask the person, because often they'll say, oh, I don't have to prove anything. I'm just telling you I don't believe in God. Really? That's called a worldview. As I told one guy at a debate, you need to take a course of philosophy. And I was getting a little bugged at him because he kept saying I don't have a worldview. And so I said, you know what? An intro to philosophy course will probably be all you need to change you around.
Yeah, same with the rejection of sources because they are biased, quote unquote. Now you made the George Washington illustration. Let's say this source does have a bias. All right. So let's say you're looking at a source, you know there's some kind of bias. I mean, every source does, right? And so you have to ask, why are they biased? Why do they have this bias? What made them have this faith? What made them believe in Jesus? Where did their faith in Jesus even come from? Why did they think Jesus was more than a man? And then boom, we're right back into talking about the evidence for Jesus' resurrection again.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I ask students, we don't know. I tell Christians, don't say that the disciples died for what they believed to be true. They were willing to die for what they believed to be true. But, and by the way, the eyewitnesses for whom we have first century attestation to their martyrdom are the big three: Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus. James reported by Josephus. So there you're out from that New Testament rule that some of these folks don't like. But I say to them, I'm not reading their minds. How do you know that they were willing to die? I'm not reading their minds. I'm reading their feet. And they'll say, well, what do you mean? Well, when a guy goes into the same area of Asia Minor again, or when he goes into the same city a second and third time and he's already been beat up once or twice, why do you go back? Oh, well, because there's a church there. And then they realize what they said, and they realize the person was committed enough to be willing to get beat up a second time. And that shows you they were willing to die. They put their money where their mouth was, so to speak. They were showing you they really truly believed Jesus died because they were willing to die to go back and tell other people about the gospel message. Oh, but let me add one thing about those creeds. About 80% of the early creeds, there's dozens of them in the New Testament, these really early comments, about 80% of them, you don't learn a systematic theology from them. About 80% of them teach the message of the gospel, which is defined in the New Testament is a minimum, the factual side, a minimum of the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Deity, death, and resurrection, and are you willing to say, I do, to that Jesus? About 80% of those creeds are on that subject, like Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised from the dead, you'll be saved. That's a great verse, and it's very, very early. And by the way, Rudolf Bultmann admitted that about Romans 10:9.
Okay, so we listed 6 minimal facts at the beginning of our discussion. And just to recap, they are the death of Jesus, number 1. Number 2, the disciples' belief that they saw the risen Jesus. Number 3, the early preaching of the gospel. Number 4, the transformation of the disciples. Number 5, the conversion of the church persecutor Paul. And then number 6 was the conversion of the skeptic James. But then we have these 6 backup facts to add to the mix that you have in part 4 of your book. Number one is the empty tomb, not granted by virtually every critical scholar, but the overwhelming majority of scholars. Last time we talked, Gary, I think it was 75%. Is that still around the same number, or did that increase a little bit?
In the last survey I did, it went from 75 to 80.
Okay, so still the overwhelming majority of scholars, and it's better now.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think these New Testament scholars, the Third Quest for the Historical Jesus folks, the data we have, I think that's pushing people and in that direction to admit more data.
All right, so the first of the 6 backup facts is the empty tomb. That's number one. And so let's talk about the second of these 6 backup facts. What is number 2?
Well, we've already, I don't do them in any order. I always do the empty tomb as number 7, because I'll call it 6 plus 1, because the reason it's not quite a minimal fact, that there's as much data for the empty tomb as there is for any of the previous 6. There's as much data for the empty tomb, but critics don't admit it as readily. So that kind of plays off the second reason. I say the empty tomb next, but you already mentioned the fact of Sunday, why are they worshiping on Sunday when there's no apparent reason to worship on that day. I talk about the burial, the data for the burial of Jesus, which is, of course, in between. Well, it's what we call Black Saturday, and then the women find the tomb empty. And we don't often push the fact that the male disciples were hiding, John tells us, for fear of the Jews. Let the women go to the tomb. We'll stay here because the Romans might be upset with us. You know, that sounds like a crazy reason. But the fact that it happened in Jerusalem is very, very important. If you're in Rome declaring the gospel of deity, death, resurrection, and someone says, oh, that's crazy, they're not going to get on a ship and sail to Israel, especially with how dangerous it is. But the fact that you could, in the city where it was first preached and Jesus died and Jesus was seen, they could have it wasn't on a Sabbath, it was Sunday, but they could take a Sabbath day's journey and go to the tomb and ascertain that nobody was there. And by the way, critics will often say, well, what if there's, in fact, a very major critic said, what happens if there's a body in the tomb, but it was kind of rotten a little bit 50 days later, according to your own source in Acts? This is a critic talking. 50 days later, and they couldn't tell it was Jesus. I'll say, look, you're not listening. The New Testament says the tomb was empty. It doesn't say there was a body there that we couldn't make out who it was. And besides, if that body has nail holes in the lower palm beginning the wrist, or if it has a wound in the side, if there's nails wounds in the feet, most likely, if you can't see the exact characteristics on the face, most likely this is Jesus. But the New Testament point is nobody was in the tomb. So all the other ones, except for the empty tomb in Jerusalem, the other ones, that's another reason I don't use all 12. They're not quite as strong. They don't drive it's not the critics won't admit them. They admit them. Some disagree on the empty tomb, 20% about. But it's that doesn't really help the case that much. So I'll take the data that back up the 6 plus the empty tomb plus Jerusalem.
Good. Yeah. So we've got these 6 main facts. And then in part 4 of your book, we have 6 backup facts. Number 1 is the empty tomb. And then number 2 is the burial. And there's a cluster of 4 more that you grouped together, which people can get the book to get all the details on that. But I want to explore the personal dimension of this a little bit, Gary, because on the one hand, Christians do need to learn some kind of a way to engage with our skeptical friends about Jesus, and especially with people who may have been influenced by the approach of some of these critical scholars, these very skeptical scholars. But on the other hand, we as Christians also need to think about this evidence because we can go through our own doubts as well. And so not even coming from a place of skepticism, some Christians need to grapple with these minimal facts because of their own doubts. Even if we do know how to engage with critical scholars on their own terms, there is a kind of emotional doubt that we sometimes go through. And Gary, I know you know what it's like to go through doubts, and that Christians can go through doubts. Even in the midst of the work that you've done in this area, you've experienced some of this. So what advice would you give Christians, especially to young Christians, young people maybe in college, who are going through a valley of doubt, a season of doubt in their lives?
Well, I went through doubt, very serious doubt, 10 straight years and part of 10 more years. So about 20 years. And as I tell people, my doubt was framed at the beginning and at the end by the deaths of the two most important people in my life. And my doubt ended at the end just a few years before the mother of my 4 children died of stomach cancer. And I thought, I'm remarried, thank the Lord, but she died of stomach cancer. And I thought to myself, I wrote in this little diary. I don't keep a diary, but I was keeping some notes, and I thought, oh, great. My doubt will probably come back. I haven't been away from it for that long. My doubt will probably come back. And to God's glory, I mean, it's to God's glory regardless, but to God's glory, the doubt never came back. My doubt stopped about 1990. She died in 1995. My doubts have never come back. I'm very thankful. I tend to think that the Lord took me through it so I could help other people. And I will mention this, Mikkel. I've got 3 books on doubt. 2 of them, I just haven't gotten to the 3rd one yet to get it up there, but 2 of the 3 are available for free on my website, GaryHabermas.com. 2 of the 3 books on doubt, including the most theoretical one. And most doubt is not factual. Most doubt is emotional. According to surveys, about 70 to 80% of doubt is emotional. And the best way I can say it is, it usually happens to people with personality traits like anxiety or obsessive compulsive. I don't say OCD. I don't say the D, the obsessive compulsive disorder. But if they have obsessive tendencies, that and anxiety are 2 of the big producers. And think about this. Here's a question. If the doubt hurts, it's probably emotional, because asking for facts is not painful. But asking about doubt and how do I know I'm a Christian? How do I know there's a heaven? And if you live for that and you obsess on that, it's going to have some baggage, some pain, most likely. That's emotional doubt. I would recommend the person go after their emotions. And the book I would recommend most, bestseller, is, there's a lot of books that do this, but Telling Yourself the Truth by William Backus and Marie Chapian. Backus, Backus, Chapian, Chapian, published by Bethany. And it tells you how to get a hold of your emotions. It's not pile on the evidences. It's C.S. Lewis's phrase. Lewis says, tell your emotions where to get off. And you have to learn to dictate to your emotions and say, I'm not going down that road because. That's how you go after it.
Wow. Yeah. I know in my life, I appreciate how objective the basis of our faith is, and that the truth transcends my mood. And so I can just be a sad Christian at times, and the Bible is very real about this. We have the lament Psalms. Jesus wept. It's okay to be a sad Christian at times. But I know that all the evidence for Jesus' existence, Jesus' resurrection, didn't just evaporate overnight because of my mood, because I happen to be sad that day. And so I cling to that. Even when I'm going through hard times, I know that the evidence for Jesus' burial, his resurrection, the resurrection appearances, all these things didn't just evaporate overnight. I cling to that because it's something that's beyond me and it's not dependent on my emotions.
Yep.
And I love how Paul in Philippians can talk about contentment. He says, I can say all the stuff that the world says is amazing. He lists all his credentials and all his prestige. He says, none of it compares to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. This other stuff is like rubbish compared to knowing Jesus. So
that's right. It was number one for him. So,
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, who used to be an enemy of the Christian faith, right?
Yep.
Another great thing to pay attention to when we talk about Paul. Well, Gary, is there anything else you want to add to this broadcast before we land the plane on the show today?
Yeah, no, I think what you started there with doubt is where I would go. This 4th volume of the 4 volumes that you started out the show with, the fourth volume, only the first 2 volumes are apologetics. The 3rd volume is contemporary theology. Where are critics today? And the fourth volume is What Difference Does the Resurrection Make for Theology and Practice? So in the fourth volume, I talk about things like death and dying, dealing with doubt, how do we do stewardship and selling out our life to Christ? These are tough times. How do you assure that you and your family and your children and those closest to you, how do you step in and help them to see that this is the most important thing? Don't walk away from it. There's nothing more important than this. So all the emotional and satisfactory things in life that make life worth living, I think making a bridge from the resurrection to that kind of application is what the resurrection. I mean, there's a reason the resurrection is absolutely the center of the New Testament. And when the disciples are beaten up in Acts 4 and 5, they leave and they were rejoicing as in First Peter, as in other books. We're told to rejoice when these times come, because we were worthy to suffer for Jesus. I just told a friend of mine today who got outed from a public event because he was a believer and he was made to not show up after he was invited. I reminded him that in the Beatitudes in Matthew, he says, "Blessed are you when people say all manner of evil things against you." And he says, hang in there, because great is your reward in heaven. Now, that's a great promise, that even name calling and that's not a reason to leave the faith or have questions. That's a reason to rejoice, as the New Testament says over and over again. So that's where I would take the resurrection, what difference it makes for everyday life.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, for being on the show today. Appreciate you taking the time.
I enjoyed it, Mikkel. I always enjoy being on with you. I've been refusing dozens of interviews. This is the first one I've done in a long time, because we've done, I think we've hit it off real well in other broadcasts, and I'm tickled if it helps just a few people today.
Thank you so much. And we thank you for joining us on the Apologetics Guys show as well today. Please do us a favor if you enjoyed this episode. Help us get the word out about the podcast. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, you can rate us on Spotify, or you can drop a comment on the video right here on YouTube if you're on the YouTube side watching the video. I'd really appreciate your help on that. If you have a question that you'd like have answered about the historical Jesus, you can drop that there as well. Click or tap the screen to watch another episode with Gary Habermas that I did called Empty Tomb, Not Empty Claims, for more on the resurrection. I'll drop a link in the show notes as well. I'm your apologetics guy, Dr. Mikkel Del Rosario. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep the faith.